one of the things I've been very excited to do in this new format on the show is to have long form conversations with some people who I find very interesting. And one of those people is a gentleman named Peter St Onge. He's an economist, he's a thinker, he's a writer, and I have been very interested in his counterintuitive wisdom. And if you've watched the show or listened to the show much, you know that I say counterintuitive wisdom is where it's at. And so I've asked Peter St Onge to join us, and I want to bring him right on. Peter, thanks for being with me.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
So I followed you a lot on Facebook is where I found you, but we have a mutual friend. He's also, he's with the Mises Institute, and that's Tho Bishop. So you've known Tho for a little while, huh?
For sure. I've known Tho close on 10 years. He's a great guy. Yeah. We were living down in Auburn for a while. So we used to go have drinks quite a lot.
So when you and I were talking about doing this show together, I had mentioned that we were going to practice, and we both got a chuckle out of Allen Iverson, the basketball player's interview, where he kept saying practice. And I told you there was this comedian named Frank Caliendo who read the practice script in Morgan Freeman's voice. So before we get serious and learn lessons about important things, I just have to share with you who this guy is. This is one of my favorite comedians, Frank Caliendo, and he's been asked to do this impersonation.
John Madden and Morgan Freeman ordering food at McDonald's.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, okay, I would like, what do you want, Morgan? Well, I've been thinking about this for quite a while. Not really sure what I want. Let's see, a Big Mac, quarter pounder with cheese. Let's see, one or the other.
That sounds just like him.
Truly, believe it or not, that's what I do. Let's see, let's just go with fries.
Stu driving this Daisy, my goodness.
Okay.
Hey, can I get some extra ketchup with?
Isn't that hilarious? This guy's fantastic. So here's his George Bush, and then we'll get
President Bush. I love it. Sometimes he'll get up to the podium and he'll have to talk about something very serious, but he has that smirk on his face the entire time. It's like somebody told him a joke backstage, a really dirty joke, and that's the only thing he can think of while he's going up. And he knows he can't tell it to you, but he's thinking about it and wants to let you in on it. He'll get up there and be like,
Hello, America. And those of you from Nantucket.
guys back there know what I'm talking about.
I'll let everybody figure out the Nantucket part of it. I don't know. The Liberty Lounge. So before we get started, Peter, tell us a little bit about yourself, about your scholarship, economics, and that sort of stuff.
So I am an economist. I've been into econ. I pretty much got into as a kid. I used to read The Economist magazine, which didn't used to be a progressive mouthpiece back then. And, I got excited in this idea that you could learn a set of knowledge that would let you make the world a better place, right? You could help poor countries get richer. You could make billions of people's lives better by using economics. So I was really excited about it, went to school to study it. Never heard of Austrian economics in school. I went to college at McGill in Canada, and I had never heard the name Mises, never heard the name Rothbard. I had literally never heard of these people until I was well past graduated college. I was working at a company in strategic marketing. And, kind of missed that feeling that you're making the world a better place. So went back, was reading, got into Mises. He led me to Rothbard, really kind of gave me, sort of rekindled my love for economics. And then I ended up going back and getting the PhD at George Mason. After that, I've been teaching in Taiwan for about 8 years. We kind of went there on a lark. We wanted to go to some new country, try something new. Being a professor is funny. If you don't care very much about how prestigious you are, then you're almost plug and play. I mean, like, you may as well be like a tennis coach or something. I mean, you know, you can just go to some random university somewhere in the world, and from their perspective, all economics professors are identical. So they just pick you up out of the toolbox and they plug, you know, I don't know, you're like a light bulb. They just stick you in and you work, which is pretty funny because it begs the question whether we're skilled labor. You know, I mean, normally, you know, like, you know, if you're like a corporate lawyer, that's not the case, right? So maybe being a professor is not very skilled after all. But anyway, so went over to Taiwan. We were there for about 8 years. In Taiwan, you're kind of outside the mainstream, right? So, you know, I felt like I wasn't really influencing the world very much. So we came back last year. I joined a think tank in Canada. And then about a year ago, we moved back to the States. So I've been more involved in sort of public advocacy here. You know, partly COVID, and then now branching out in the cryptocurrencies, which I've been talking about for a long time. But you know, we can talk more about that. But I sort of concluded that a lot of the challenges facing us at the moment have more to do with how to isolate yourself from what's happening, as opposed to necessarily joining in the glorious public discourse, which, as you know, has been trimmed to a degree from censorship.
Right. Well, I'll tell you, when I met Tho Bishop, it was the day he was leaving to go to be an aide in Washington, D.C. We were standing at in a men's clothing store in line. He was getting a suit. And he asked, I had a radio show. He asked if I was Burnie Thompson. And I said, yeah, you know, I'm talking to him. And I said, what do you do? He was young. He was 21, 22 years old, you know, Tho. And I said, what do you do? He says, well, I'm an economist. I said, an economist? This kid here, you know. I said, what school? And I thought, Peter, that he would say FSU, but I was testing him, right? And he said, I'm an Austrian economist. And I said, oh, okay. Well, I said, my favorite writer is F.A. Hayek. And he says, mine's von Mises. And I'm going, what who is this guy? Wow. Like, that's Hayek's teacher, right? You
nice.
know?
Yeah.
So that was how I met Tho Bishop. But I say that because most people watching probably don't know the difference between what is an Austrian economist, what's the Chicago school, and then it's slipping my mind, but what is the school before that that's opposite the Austrian school that believes we can spend our way into prosperity?
Yeah, there's various cranks, right? There were different conflicts early on. One of the big conflicts was with the Frankfurt School, which I think it's called historicism. So, you know, which actually is more or less dominant today in economics. The idea is that you ignore theory. You just go out in the real world and you experience the real world as if you're a scientist. And, you know, there's a lot of problems with that. Sort of the short answer is the data when it comes to the social sciences, the data will often tell you whatever you want to hear if you work hard enough at it, right? So, but anyway, but, you know, that's method stuff. Yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, right, you know, there's just a couple sort of core concepts in Austrian economics that when you first hear them, they sound just trivial. They sound so simple. You know, how could you get excited over that?
Right.
You know, probably the core one is Mises's human action is purposeful. And, you know, if you tell that to somebody at a cocktail party, they'll say, okay, you know, and it sounds so trivial. But once you know, as he goes through and explains it, you understand, in other words, to say action is purposeful means that people have goals. They do things not because, you know, we're random atoms. We do things because we have an objective. And then this entire world opens up from that simple statement. You know, so for example, there's no such thing as exploitation for voluntary interaction. Why? Because the boss prefers the employee to anybody else. The employee prefers the job to anybody else. How do we know this? Because they're doing it.
Yep. Right.
Yeah, I mean, there are all these fascinating implications that come out of Austria, which I think is part of the reason for its appeal.
It is for me, Peter, because one thing I've learned in life is that people anywhere and at any time want to avoid pain and gain pleasure. Right. So we enter into these agreements to do better for ourselves if we're able to do it. And these other schools that focus on, you know, pushing the right button or pulling the right lever, these other ideas of economics is that they can create an economy. Remember, Obama will create an economy that works for you. And I'm thinking the economy is not a butler. The economy is simply what happens, right? And I think a great definition, and you tell me, Professor, if it is, and I learned it from Thomas Sowell, what is economics? Well, it's the study of how scarce resources are used, and even more specifically, how scarce resources with alternative uses are used. That's what economics is. And I think it's important to remember that. But as far as simple things, right? Again, that's where wisdom's at as well. When my daughter Emma was 8 years old, she said, "Daddy, I want to show you very important proof that Alice in Wonderland is not dreaming." And she rewound the movie and she said, "Look there." And then she forwarded the movie and she said, "You see that?" And she turns and looks at me, Peter, and she says, "It's all there, Daddy, if we just look for it." And that is, to this day, one of the most profound things I've ever heard. How many things are so simple if we just notice them? There's nothing like finding something. There's nothing better than looking for it, right?
For sure. You remember the movie The Matrix?
Yeah.
Right. And, he kind of has this like enlightenment, and now he knows he's the one. Right. And now he looks at everything and he doesn't see a doorway anymore. He sees code. Right. And that's fundamentally, I think, the appeal to economics, but more than economics per se, it's to this way of understanding the world, that you're not just seeing what's on the surface, you're seeing what does it represent, where did it come from, what does it mean to people, why should we preserve it, why should we promote it?
Yeah, and again, I learned this one from Hayek. The problem with government officials trying to create an economy is they don't know what all of us want, right? They think they know what we need, but they couldn't possibly know what we all want. He calls it the knowledge problem, the fatal conceit. And I think of the Soviet Union. They didn't have enough glass to make enough windows. So the real smart guys at the top of the government said, we'll make the windows thinner. And then they broke, and then they had fewer windows. They can't possibly know what it takes for an economy, can they?
Exactly. And, right, you've got two serious problems with socialism, which, one of them is that, sort of the simpler one that everybody sort of comes to mind first is that the people in charge may not love you. They may not want for you the things that you want for you, right?
But they say they do, Peter. They say they do.
They always do, don't they? Yeah, they're like a deceptive boyfriend or something. You can't believe anything they want. They want something from you. But at any rate, it's right. So that's sort of the first question is, do they actually care about you? Do they actually have your interests at heart? And then, of course, the most and the sort of standard left-wing answer to that is that no, we're going to be very careful this time. We're going to choose only the best, only those of pure heart, the Parsifals. But even if you imagine that governments are angels, and we know they're not because we have a historical record, even if you were to imagine that in your ideal world, still, because exactly as you say, right, because they don't know you, they don't know exactly what you want, they don't know how much you want it, they simply for information reasons, they cannot make the economy function optimally, even if they wanted to, and they almost certainly don't want to. So you put those two together, and it's a disaster.
So I think about it. If government planners had been in charge in the 80s, we would never have had Snapple or Swatch watches, right? There's no way to predict that people would want those things. People want weird stuff sometimes.
For sure.
How would you define socialism? Because I don't like the strict textbook answer. I like the way I define socialism is basically when the government's plan supersedes all of our plans. Like, how would you define socialism?
Yeah, and that's sort of what statists or socialists try to do is they try to define it very, very narrowly. So they say, don't be ridiculous. Government infrastructure spending is not socialism. Socialism is, government control of the means of production. All right, so they try to very narrowly define it because they want to get to a point where we can't criticize anything until that last tiny final little push over the edge. right? So it's like somebody's pushing you towards a cliff and you say, don't push me off the cliff. And they say, you're being ridiculous. You're not falling. Look at you. I'm just moving you. And then at that very last instant, when you go off the cliff, then you say, wait a minute. Well, it's too late.
Perfect.
So, right. That's the game they play. So
here's what else I noticed about any form of collectivism where the government decides how much we get and what we can do and all of that stuff. Some of the major problems with really any form of socialism are the things that we talked about. But they say it's just because we haven't done it in a scientific way, Peter. It's just because we haven't done it like Sweden. And that's sure, first of all, let's talk about, is Sweden really a socialist country compared to the others? And secondly, I mean, we can talk about all the variables that they leave out. Right. Like culture.
Sweden has, the comparison has a number of problems. For starters, the Swedish economy is founded on things that were invented by Americans, okay? The internet, electricity, many wondrous things were invented by Americans. Yeah. It's an open question if the world only consisted of Sweden, or if all the countries in the world, had a similar economy as Sweden, they would not be able to sort of free ride off of all of these inventions that come from more capitalist systems. And of course, the other element with Sweden is that the parts of the Swedish economy that work are capitalist. In fact, they're often more capitalist than in the US system. Wow. So Sweden, broadly speaking, is not a socialist country. It uses socialist rhetoric, and I mean, Americans use, Sweden as a representative of socialist ideals. But, there are many areas such as corporate regulation. We recently saw it with COVID, right? It was far less socialist. And by the way, just a quick definition. When I use the word socialist, when I think of socialism, my quick and dirty definition is who's deciding? Right. Is an individual deciding on a voluntary basis, or is the government deciding? If the government's deciding, that's socialism, QED. So anyway, on that basis, Sweden, during COVID, it's been just a dramatic difference. And what happens? Do these socialists go back and say, do they praise that? No, they kind of forget about it. They don't talk about Sweden for a year or two, kind of let that flow under the bridge. And then they'll come back to Sweden later and they'll completely forget about this episode. So there's a lot of cherry picking that goes on with this, Swedish example.
So when I've read a bunch about economics, and I started off with, really with people like Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell, the late Walter Williams now of blessed memory. Yeah. But these are two guys I became familiar with because they wrote all the columns in the newspaper. They were accessible and they made so much sense to me. So I read a lot of Thomas Sowell's books, and then I discovered Milton Friedman, and then I moved up to a little more academic writing in F.A. Hayek, and I never made it to Mises. Okay, but these are the things that I learned. And I have a bachelor's degree in political science, and I've studied that for about a quarter of a century. But whenever somebody asks me, I've trained myself to think this way, and I want to ask you if this is an economic way of thinking of things. One of the problems now that we hear politicians and activists, they always will find an issue, any issue, healthcare, America itself, and they will compare it to utopia. Mm-hmm. And then they'll say, see, it sucks, right? It sucks. But I think I've always learned, Burnie, what do you think of this policy? Compared to what? Right? It has to be compared to something real. Compared to what? At what cost? And show me the evidence that it really works. Anything, that's the way I look at it now. And I've trained myself because of these economists. Is that an economic way of thinking of things?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's also just more broadly, it's a logical way to look at it, right? I mean, if you're proposing some change and you're just sort of imagining, so I don't know, I'm going to, change the roof structure and I imagine maybe it'll work. I don't have any examples. Every time we've tried it, it's failed, but I can imagine it'll work. That's not going to fly in construction. So, just on a very basic level, right. You were talking about this earlier that, socialists keep saying, no, we just didn't do it right last time. Now we've got science or now we've got computers or whatever it is. They keep coming up with some excuse why it'll be different this time. Or they say, no, Stalin wasn't really communist because there was this tiny little detail that I just decided this morning in the shower should be defined as socialism. So they play games. It's pure rhetoric. The bottom line is that people violently organizing societies, in other words, people telling you what to do against your will, is a bad idea. There's many, many things that can go wrong and historically do go wrong. And that should be the end of it, right? We should at that point look for voluntary ways to interact because it's good, it's moral, but it also happens to create wealth, which is actually an amazing thing, but it does. So at that point, the discussion should be over. But unfortunately, there's, as you say, an entire industry that is, partly it's a question of where it gets funding and what the interests are as an organization. They want government budgets. But at any rate, there's an entire industry, and what it produces is justifications for increased government, meaning violent control over personal lives.
Peter, one of the things I worry about the most is you talked about growing up, you would read The Economist and you would learn real economics. You could really learn things. You could read the encyclopedia and really learn knowledge, right? And today it's becoming much more difficult to get an education, to get a real education, because everything's been politicized. One of the things about Mussolini, the quintessential fascist, is he was socialist, first of all. And he said, I was first and last a socialist. And I consider fascism more of an overlay than a system. But anyway, one of the things that he said is, in fascism, because it's all about control, nothing outside the state, everything inside the state, and nothing against the state. And so, in other words, everything was political. And so now let's look at America today. Now that the government has its hand in everything, and now that learning institutions rely on funding, our knowledge has become politicized. And one of the things that worries me the most, Peter, is it's very difficult to learn the things that you and I learned growing up today, isn't it?
It is. And you see this in any kind of system like that. During the Soviet Union, if you were Russian and you wanted to learn about history, you couldn't grab the official textbooks, right? I mean, you would seek out some book that was written before they came into power. And I think increasingly, to a degree, we are already living in that system. If you want to, give a history book to your kids to read, you should not give them a book written after about 1920.
Wow. Wow.
Things go downhill. You can get, you have people who were educated before the progressives took over education, right? And so some of those people are writing in the 50s and 60s. You get people like Robert Heinlein. But broadly speaking, if you want to escape this progressive propaganda chamber, you've got to go back before it started. That looks like it's increasing.
You wrote something recently, and I think about the deficits today. And in the year 2000, we were $5 trillion in debt as a nation. And just to give people an idea, because I don't think people realize how much $1 trillion is. If Jesus spent $1 million a day, Jesus, every single day, $1 million, and he can do it because, he's Jesus. He can spend $1 million a day every single day until now. He would have to go on spending $1 million every single day for 619 more years to reach $1 trillion. $1 trillion is $1 million every single day for 2,700 years. That's how much $1 trillion is. And so now after George W. Bush and Obama took office 2009, it went from 5 trillion in debt in America to about 10 trillion. And after Obama, it was close to 20 trillion. And Trump kept going up. And now it's going to continue going up. So now we live, they say, Peter, in a post-scarcity economy. It doesn't matter deficits and debt. And you wrote an article about it. And you basically said, if deficits and debt don't matter, then why do we have taxes? So will you help me understand all of this?
Yeah, so there's this MMT professor. She was giving an interview and on Bloomberg, and the interviewer asked that question. So, one of the points of view of MMT, which is basically just standard inflationism, it's been around for forever, but they're promoting inflation. And one of their perspectives is that we don't have to worry about deficits. And so he asked, well, if you don't worry about deficits, if government can spend more money and it won't hurt anything, then why do we have taxes at all? And it was interesting because she gave two answers that should be disturbing to people. So one of them was that taxes takes money out of people's pocket, right? So that regular people don't compete with the government for resources. Right? So in other words, you want to pave your driveway, but the government wants to pave a road. And, if you are bidding for asphalt for your driveway, then, that's asphalt the government could have used. So that's one of them. She's actually, pitching as a feature that taxes, make us unable to get resources for ourselves. It kind of saves everything for the government. And then the other reason she gave was that taxes are great because you can punish people. Of course, she said incentivize people, right? So, you can pay people for buying energy efficient dishwashers and whatnot. But of course, there's a flip side to that, which is that if you're paying people, then the absence of paying them becomes a punishment. And this is quite clear when you think about public schooling, right? So you're not taxed if you fail to send your kids to public school. They don't come at you and put an extra tax on you. However, if you do send your kids to a private school, then you have to pay for it. And they don't give you the money back that you gave for the public school, right? So public school is free, hooray. However, there's an extra amount you'll have to pay if you actually don't want to use public school, rather you want to use some other school. So it's tricky.
Can I say one thing right there for people? Because this was a big lesson to me from F.A. Hayek. What you just described is another thing I trained myself to do over the years. And that is not only to see what is seen, but to see what is not seen. And you just pointed that out. It reminds me in Spain 8 years ago when they said, look at all these jobs we created. And the politicians pointed to all the guys with the hard hats. But then the economists did the study and said, yeah, but every job you created, they lost 2.3 jobs in the real economy because government's expensive and they're no longer creating wealth. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that lesson is to look for what is not obvious, right? Is so important.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And if we're talking about that sort of thing, there's a study that every dollar that the government spends destroys about $2 to $3 worth of wealth. And the reason is because in order to raise more money, the government has to raise taxes. Those taxes tend to disincentivize people. Like if you're facing a 50% tax rate, you'll work less than somebody who's facing a 20% tax rate. And then the lost production is gone. So if a doctor sees fewer patients because of the tax rate, those patients have to wait longer. Maybe their conditions deteriorate, right? So you lose productivity, you lose wealth in the process. And so people, it's very lazy that you see it on both sides where they say, look, the rich have so much, the middle class have so much, we can take $1 trillion off them and we can give it to these people. And you want to remember that every trillion that you redistribute, that wasn't just moving, money around on a table. Each trillion destroyed 2 to 3 trillion.
It's devastating. But then you have this, Peter. Then you have economic mensas like Sandy Cortez, who was talking not too long ago about Joe Biden's Rebuild America plan, because we always have to rebuild, and always have to do these kinds of things. And so I just told you how much $1 trillion is. So here's what she had to say about this. And I'd love to get your thoughts on it. And think about this in the context of what Peter just said. For every $1 trillion that the government takes out of the real economy, costs us about 2 or 3 times that much. Listen to Sandy Cortez.
Have the vision that the Biden administration has put forward. My concern is that they have allocated $2.25 trillion over about 8 years to act out on this vision. And it's just not enough. If we actually want, in good faith, to make this vision and the commitments that they've put down happen, we need a more robust investment. I have real serious concerns that 2.25 trillion over 8 years is not going to get us there. And for context, because when we say,
all right, I don't know if I can take any of your context, Peter, but I'd love to get your thoughts on that. And again, I bring up Hayek again, but you'll know this quote: "The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men or congresswomen like Sandy Cortez how little they really know about what they imagine they can design." Perfect, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the key quotes that everybody should have learned in school. Right. I mean, there are a couple problems with her point of view on that. For starters, the name of a spending bill generally has very little to do with what's in that bill. Right. So there was one tally that something like 10% of the infrastructure bill is what most people would think of as infrastructure. You know, it's bailing out anybody who's ever done a favor for the Democratic Party. I mean, it's just a crony payola with a tiny little bit of infrastructure painted on the outside so that you can give it the name.
Like the Affordable Care Act or the Consumer Protection Act.
Exactly.
They're opposite.
And it's amazing to me that they're properly skeptical of politicians. Most Americans know that politicians are lying scumballs. If you say this at a dinner party, few people will disagree with you. We know that, companies, if a company says something, if they say this is the best in the world, and then we come back and say, oh my gosh, they got the best in the world, you would look like an idiot. Yet these same people who are properly skeptical and then all of a sudden they say infrastructure bill sounds fantastic. We need it.
Yeah.
So, right. That's the first sort of problem here. The second problem is, if you want infrastructure, incentivize the private sector to create the infrastructure, because as you said earlier, the private sector can figure out who actually needs the infrastructure.
And who wants it. Yeah. And who needs it on infrastructure. Right. Yeah. Right.
So once you understand how these infrastructure, funds are being allocated, even the small amount that is bridges and roads, that's not going where the need is the most. That's going to, congressional districts. It's all payola.
We know that Congress has a super low approval rating, right? It's usually like 15%. So it's interesting, isn't it, that at the same time, voters and people don't approve of Congress, incumbents win more than 90% of their races. So I actually have thought of a political reform, Peter. Like if we did this, America would be better tomorrow. And here it is. If I were the king, you could no longer, every voter would vote for every other congressman but their own. And that would do it. I'm telling you, we wouldn't even need anything else. We just get new Congress people all the time.
Nice.
How about that one?
Nice.
So let's talk a little bit about this idea that you've been sharing with me offline, and it's just fascinating because I didn't know any of this, and it has to do with the lost golden age, the Gilded Age. I don't even know much about the Gilded Age. So what are we taught in school? And again, here comes the counterintuitive wisdom. What's the real story?
Yeah. So to the extent we learn it in school, we probably learned it as the Gilded Age. And, gilded, of course, is something that looks like gold, but is not. So it's kind of a fake. And the implication is that, so this is the period around 1870 to 1900, right around then. And the reason why this is a fascinating era is, so first of all, the Gilded Age name was put on it by socialist journalists. Okay, that's pure claptrap, garbage. So let's discard that for a second and let's look at this age here. So you had a 30-year period where essentially the entire modern world was built. It is astounding. Everything around you, electricity, the internet, communications, oil, petroleum, the entire modern world, telephones, televisions, radio, everything. It was all built in this one period.
Now, you said the internet. How would the I can understand the other things, but how would the internet connect to that?
Yeah, sorry. Right. So the internet is fundamentally, it's based on technology which came out of this period. So that would have been the telegraph specifically. The internet's actually interesting because that was fully formed as the internet that we know and love by about the 1950s, I think it is. 1950s, maybe early 60s. So it was already there, but there were government regulations against selling things. You couldn't do anything commercial on the internet, right? You could only use it. It was reserved for research.
Right. By the way, right now, the social media hyenas are going back. Now that they heard you say the internet structure has been around since the 50s, they're going back looking for Eisenhower and Truman's social media profiles. They want to trash them.
For sure.
We got to be careful, Peter.
I know it. These guys, they're going to get canceled.
The MySpace accounts are going to be horrific.
Right. Eisenhower's MySpace.
Right.
But yeah, so essentially the entire modern world was invented during this period. Here, take me Elon Musk, all right? Elon Musk does electric cars, which were invented right around, I think, 1870. He does rocket science, which was fully developed by 1903. He does, subways that run in pneumatic tubes, which actually existed. That's the Hyperloop. That actually existed in New York in 1871. Okay. You had car elevators that, like, when you went to park your car and it was downtown, and so it was kind of expensive. So this little elevator that would lift your car up and the other car could come in. This is like in 1900. If you wanted to send a mail, like a document, you're a law firm, you want to send a document to somebody else in the city, there was a pneumatic system that connected all of the major buildings in downtown New York, downtown Chicago. You would put the thing in the little pneumatic tube in your office, and it would shoot over to the other office.
Wow.
You would go to restaurants, instead of waiting for the waiter, you would have a little button you would push, and then the light would go off in the kitchen. It would indicate. Now, these are not amazing to us today, but the point is these existed over 100 years ago. And by the way, many of them disappeared. The pneumatic tubes are gone. The waiter call devices, a lot of these things have actually regressed. Peter Thiel has talked about that.
Can I guess why? Yeah. I want to guess why that is. I'm going to guess why.
Okay.
Because of efficiency. When we have great efficiency, you're going to get the union types say that those kill jobs. It's like the opposite. It's the converse of what Obama said. Do you remember when Obama said that we have some jobless issues because of kiosks and ATM machines? It's that whole tech. Economics in one lesson. Henry Hazlitt talked about it. The curse of machines, right? Basically saying technology costs us jobs. So what happened to these great advances in efficiency and technology?
Right. So, and by the way, there's a story about Milton Friedman. He was visiting India, and he visited, they were building a dam, I think, a dam or a highway, and they were using shovels. And he asked the guy, he said, "Why aren't you using bulldozers? Why are you using shovels?" And the guy said, "Well, because it creates jobs." And then Friedman said, "Well, why don't you use spoons?"
There's so many more people.
Exactly.
Wow, that is so, he was so great at that, right? I know that some real smart Austrian scholarly economics can find, fallacies maybe in Friedman's scholarship, but when it came to explaining it to us, he's as good as it gets.
For sure, he had zingers, and most Austrians. I mean, I should mention on almost all topics, Austrians and Friedman are on the same team. Rothbard has said Friedman was good on everything except money. The irony being that Friedman is most known for money. So, right, broadly speaking, Friedman is a good guy. He had a couple errors here and there. But right, so going back to the Gilded Age now, or the Golden Age, most of the technology is still here, right? I don't want to imply that we've gone significantly backwards. But the sort of more important question is, we had this period where technology was progressing so amazingly fast, and what the heck happened? It stopped. It almost stopped. You know, if we go back over the last 30 years, and that's where the internet comes in. So if you ask most people, what are the biggest technological advancements over the past 30 years? There has been cool stuff in medicine. Agree. I think not nearly enough, but at any rate. But outside of that, what have been the really big inventions? And most people would say the internet and maybe the cell phone. But of course, the internet was fully formed by the 1950s or 60s. It was, you know, sort of the pre-internet exist. In other words, if you take when the telegraph was invented, okay, before the telegraph, if you wanted to communicate with somebody from, say, London to India, it would take you about 6 months round trip, okay? Before the telegraph. You would have to send a letter on a ship that would have to wait for favorable winds, all right? So the advancement from sending a letter on a ship to the telegraph is tremendous. That's one heck of a jump.
Hey,
right?
you know, I met a lady, she was 80 years old in the late 90s.
Right.
And I asked her, I used to do medical sales, and I was helping her with some equipment, and I was in her home. And I asked her, what is the greatest invention of your lifetime? And I thought she was going to say what you said. And you know what she told me? In her lifetime,
What?
She said washing machines. She said you wouldn't believe it was an all-day task. It was, the work was so hard. It was all day to wash clothes. The washing machine. I'll never forget that.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. For sure. And, you know, if we look at in terms of economic impact, so a lot of these things that were invented in that golden age, they weren't commercialized for a long time, right? Partly because of what happened. And my hypothesis is essentially that the progressive era, I mean, it's not only me, I think this is a broad belief among free marketers. The progressive era came in and put in a bunch of reforms that slowed down technology. It slowed down invention. It also slowed down the development of technology. So, you know, part of this had to do with, right, unions, as you said. So, you know, unions got special privileges that allowed them to make it harder for companies to operate, but also harder for them to make advancements. Other parts were, you know, governments got greedy and they wanted a piece of the pie. Really, probably the single biggest one is just the growth of the regulatory state. Right. And that's something that happened. What I think 1918 is sort of the beginning of that era, where previous to that, courts in the U.S. had seen economic freedom as essentially on the same par as human rights. All right. You had a fundamental human right to work at any wage you like, under any conditions you like. Right, there was sort of sanctity of contract, right? So if you wanted to sign on to a job that was dirty and dangerous, but you wanted to do it because it's a very high wage, that was allowed. And you had this switch in sort of the legal system where now it was no longer you have the right to do whatever you want economically. Now it was increasingly you have to get permission. Yes. Right, you've got these overlords who decide whether they like your employment terms and so on.
Yeah, and this is, you know, the conversation, and I don't want to go here yet. We'll do it another day about minimum wage. You know, I'm big on definitions. You know, we think in terms as humans in definitions and concepts, and so, you know, when I realized that, you know, what a wage is, it changed my way of thinking. A wage is simply how much I can sell my labor for. You know, it's just not what somebody's going to pay me. I'm part of this negotiation. That's why if we can develop a rarer skill, we can sell our labor at a higher price. A wage is how much we can sell our labor. And that's so important. So what you're talking about is our ability to choose and sell our labor at a higher price was stolen from us. And it's easy to point at those harsh labor conditions and say, that's an advancement in human history. But that goes back to at what cost, right? Compared to what? We see that, but what do we not see? And you're suggesting what we're not seeing are so many more inventions, right? That our quality of life could be way better.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, specific to the minimum wage, the minimum wage, it generally doesn't bite high wage workers, right? Sort of to get the picture on it, another way to phrase the minimum wage, all right, if you say we should have a minimum wage, you could also say we should outlaw low skill labor. Yeah. And those are identical statements.
That's right. I always say minimum wage is criminalizing work. It's criminalizing work at a level politicians point to.
Exactly. So, right. I mean, the main victims of the minimum wage have probably not been technology per se. I mean, sort of indirectly because it increases costs and such, or it may actually remove productive people from jobs. But anyway, we can get into that when we talk about the minimum wage. But right. I mean, the main harm of the minimum wage has been sort of an army of people who cannot legally be employed. Now, many of them work under the table. I grew up in inner city Philadelphia, and there's lots of people who do work. They do it for cash. But there are also a lot of people who can't do that. There's only certain jobs that work for that because the employer is afraid of getting in trouble. So, often workers either have to have no job whatsoever, or they have to sort of work in this underground economy where, if you're working for somebody who's willing to break the law, that person may not be of the best character, and bad things may happen to you. They may withhold your wages to keep it.
Yeah. So you grew up in Philly.
I did. I grew up in
What years? I mean, were you there in the 70s and 80s?
Yeah, it was the 1970s and 80s. So it was a terrible time for Philadelphia. It was a crap hole. To be frank,
you had my favorite basketball players. I'm so jealous. You had Julius Erving, World B. Free.
That was the one thing we had.
Man, I'm so jealous right now. I can't even tell you. When in 1983, when we got Moses Malone, I say we, and I didn't even live in Philly. I was in LA getting our butts kicked every year by Magic and Kareem. But when we got Moses, it was faux, baby. We won that one, didn't we?
Yeah.
Wow, that's so cool. So the golden age, the gilded age. So journalists are the ones and historians are the ones who distorted that reality.
I think that is absolutely right. And, that's sort of, we can broaden that, whether we talk about censorship, whether we talk about, sort of hiding our history, rewriting our history, I think absolutely journalists and academia are sort of in this cooperative venture to sort of rewrite facts as propaganda. And I think that's extremely damaging.
Yeah, it is extremely damaging. It goes back to what I worry so much about, Peter. Do you teach economics classes? I mean, I know you have a PhD in economics, I believe.
Right.
So are you also a professor? Do you teach it?
I was for 8 years.
Okay.
Yeah. Now I mostly write. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, when people hear about economics, the way that it was presented to me by people like Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell, it becomes so fascinating because it's no longer about graphs and stuff I didn't care about. It's really about scarcity. And what does Thomas Sowell say? The first rule of economics is scarcity, and the first rule of politicians is to ignore that rule. And that's just what we see. They keep doing it over and over. So professors see it so differently. And now we have my kids are 17 and 18, and I'm so worried about them going to college. I mean, I spent a lot of years in college. I got out eventually on good behavior, Peter, but I spent a lot of time. But I did learn some stuff, most of it not in college, but it was important. The discipline of scholarship is important. And that's something that is not being taken seriously anymore. The students now think they're smarter than the professors, at least online. Will you tell me, talk to me about that? I mean, I'm so worried. I've said it twice now about learning, about real knowledge.
Yeah, we've got, I think, sort of good news and bad news. So starting with the bad news, I agree that academia has really fallen. For starters, if you're not on board with this, progressive takeover, then you should absolutely ask your politicians to stop funding these clowns. There should be no taxpayer money to universities, in my opinion. There are some useful things that universities do, like basic R&D, sciences, but before those were funded at the university level, companies did them. So, and companies do them because they're hoping to develop a product that consumers will pay for, and that works. So, yeah, in my opinion, we should absolutely defund the universities. The K-12, right, which is about 90% of Americans pre-COVID, about 90% of Americans sent their kids to public schools. So absolutely, there needs to be competition there. It's pretty easy to do on a technical level where you just have the money follow the kid. So whatever the parents, if they're going to homeschool, if they're going to send the kid, whatever it is, you just have the money follow the kid. And you want to do that on the tax return so that government's not, involved in regulating schools. But right. So in that sense, yes, I think sort of formal education is shot. It needs to be defunded. It needs a ton of competition. But at the same time, there's also very good news. And what that is if you talk to kids, they get stuff on the internet. And they get a whole variety of stuff on the internet. Kids, so my own kids are 10 and 12. They are much more sophisticated than people give them credit for. Kids can sort stuff out. If you let a kid run wild on YouTube, they're going to find lots of garbage. They're also going to find, setting aside censorship for the moment, they're going to find the truth here and there, hiding. So people today, I think, educate themselves, right? So when you and I were growing up, there was no internet. You had to, if there had been an internet, I certainly would have known about Rothbard and Mises before I was 30 years old.
Right.
Right. So yes, the universities and schools are probably worse than they were when we were growing up. They were already pretty bad when we were growing up. I mean, in terms of ideology and, not teaching, but propagandizing. So yes, that formal education probably got worse. But the internet is such a quantum leap in the ability for people to peer-to-peer share information. Even today, right, we've got the censorship age, but still, you have decentralized platforms. You can have platforms that are based on cryptocurrency. They're based on the same technology that underlies Bitcoin, which is similar to BitTorrent, if you remember that. So you've got peer-to-peer ways for people to get information to each other to an extent that, Murray Rothbard talked about when he was first starting out and sort of getting political, he learned about libertarianism because he happened into I think it was like an anarchist bookstore, and there was some magazine there, and in the back of it said, to subscribe, send $20 in a self-addressed stamped envelope. All right. And that was it. There was no other way to get it.
Yeah.
Right. And, he said you could get the entire libertarian movement in a single living room in New York. Right. Today, we have millions upon millions. Yeah. And that wasn't formal education that did that.
Right. Right. No, for sure. Yeah. And I want to end with this, Peter. I'm worried about there is a book, and I haven't yet read it. I've just heard like Dennis Prager talk about it a lot. The Closing of the American Mind. And I think it was probably written in the 80s by Bloom. I believe it was somebody Bloom. But I think about the closing of the American mind. Gosh, I love when ideas collide and reason prevails. But you know who doesn't love that? Those who are either lying or who know they're wrong. Right. And so what I'm seeing now is this Taliban tolerance, right? Where it's dangerous to say normal things. So in this environment, I know that there's got to be a reaction. Mm-hmm. There's always a reaction to something. Churchill was a great reaction to Hitler. Magic Johnson was a terrific reaction to Larry Bird. See, it always happens. So now here we are. And I know there's got to be a response to this. There's got to be a reaction, and you're touching on it. I know that this has got to present opportunities. And I think they're going to present opportunities that don't even know of yet. It might be this peer-to-peer stuff. It might be this blockchain communication. So help me become more optimistic.
I am optimistic in the medium term. I think a lot of things are going to get stupider and crazier because that's the trend. But I think sort of the saving grace is that the crazies are crazy. They don't have bumpers. They don't have wisdom and prudence, and they can't control themselves. And they make new enemies every day. They don't, sit and strategize. Let's not go after these people because they're powerful and influential. And eventually, they make enough enemies that there's a consensus to, stop these guys being such bullies. So, I mean, historically, to sort of put it in perspective, there's an expression in Japanese called heiwa baka, which means peace stupid. Okay. And the idea is that if your society has been at peace too long, you sort of forget the danger. Okay. And, you're very complacent about running risks. Now, Japanese talk about this in the context of, say, aggression from China, and they may lament that, Japanese don't do anything about it because, they sort of just can't imagine that war could ever be a thing. But in this context, the point is that our American society has been so relatively peaceful for so long that I think a lot of people are just kind of playing it fast and loose and seeing what happens if we do this. And, if they go back through history, you really don't want that pendulum swinging so hard. It's not good for either side. I don't want people on the other side to suffer. I disagree with them. I don't want innocent people to suffer. I don't think any of us do. And, over time, as these aggressors get more energetic and seek out more targets, I do think that enough people in the center are going to come together and say, this is not who we are. This is, no, this has got to stop. And at that point, I mean, politicians believe nothing, which in normal times is disappointing. But in this context, they will switch on a dime if they think that's what public opinion wants.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. Peter, how can people find you and read your articles? And I would love to do this more with you. I'll tell you one thing I've been thinking about, and I'd love to kind of develop my thoughts on it. And that's this, to a future conversation. It used to be, even 10 years ago, one thing that made America really great is that we're different all over. We're many different cultures, right? Out of many, one. And we all had our community. So what they were doing in New York City was a little different than what we were doing in Panama City. Mm-hmm. But and when we went to the store, we had sort of an allegiance with each other, right? But now in the social media age at its apex, it has centralized tribalism. In other words, people in Panama City, we don't necessarily see each other as neighbors as much as when we go online and we are on a side, right? Mm-hmm. So this centralization of tribalization is worrying me. I want a decentralization of tribalism. Do you see where I'm going with this? And I want to develop this idea because I wonder what it's doing to us, to our moral compasses, to the way we're wired. I think it's dangerous.
Right. I mean, we've always kind of had the social wisdom that you avoid politics, right? So, famously, what do you not discuss at the dinner table? Religion and politics. Right. We've always had a social consensus to live and let live, to tolerate others' points of views. And right, I think that we're losing some of that probably because of social media. It sort of encourages this tribalism and this extremism. But at the same time, I think that culturally we still do have that. So, I mean, you talk to your neighbors. I know where we live, we're a completely mixed community. We've got new Democrats, who are woke. We've got old Democrats like, union types. We've got Republicans, we got libertarians, we got all of us mixed together. And in fact, I mean, sometimes we mention who we vote for, and it's fine because we're neighbors. Being a neighbor is almost like being family. You're stuck with each other. So, you know, I'm encouraged that we do work together. We live in the same communities. Our kids are on the same softball teams. You know, I do think that our communities are thick enough to get through this and to reestablish that norm that has kept social peace for so long, that we don't have to approve of every aspect of each other's life or beliefs or lifestyle. Just tolerate it. Live and let live.
Yeah. I asked a question, then I interrupted myself. Where can people find you, and how can they learn more about you and your articles?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook, Peter J. St Onge, and then I'm over at Twitter at Prof. St Onge, so Prof. Stonge. And those basically lead to everything else. I've also got a website, prophetsofchaos.com.
Peter, you're the best. I appreciate it. I look forward to next time.
It was a pleasure, Burnie. Thank you.
All right. Take care. Peter St Onge. I've been wanting to do this for a long time. I hope you enjoy this. Part of the reason that I started doing this new show, this new format, is to still do my watchdog stuff, right? But also to do long form conversations, and not only about economics and not only about politics, but about life and about all kinds of stuff. And I'm looking forward to doing that. All right. Thanks so much for being with me. I will see you again very soon.